Hello and welcome to another digital wildlife walk with myself, Russell Headley from Nature Talks and Walks. And today we are talking all about the wild roses of the UK. It's the 22nd of April 2021. So this is a good time to talk about roses just before they start flowering and really appearing. Once we get into May and early June, the wild roses will be more obvious. But this is a look at the family of roses. And as you'll see as we go through some of the species tonight, sometimes a rose doesn't look like a rose at all. And I'll tell you more about it as we go through. So I'm going to show you share my presentation now. Here we go. And then we'll go into the presentation itself. So title image is a classic rose of the wild of Britain. Our wild roses are probably familiar as roses, but perhaps are unfamiliar in terms of the roses that we buy in the supermarket, or we buy at Valentine's Day, the big bunch of red or white roses. These are very different species, and they have all sorts of different uses and places that they grow as well. As usual, I think you guys all know this now, so if the quality goes down, you can stop your video. You're all muted for this session, and you can talk at the end just to make sure that everyone can hear everything nice and clearly. And you can also put questions into chat as we go through. And at the end, I'll check chat first of all to see if we have any questions. Okay, so as I say, the word rose in our minds probably conjures up a very certain type of plant. If I say rose, you're probably thinking of quite a large flower, tall with thorns on the stems. And this is true, that is a rose, but it actually belongs to a family of plants that are found across the planet on every continent pretty much, including the coasts of Greenland and as far south as Australia. And they're fairly successful. The family that I talk about is Rosaceae, and this is a family of plants that includes the roses in the literal sense, but also a host of other plants, which we might not necessarily link to them. Now, the last time we looked at a family of plants was the daisy family, and that is arguably one of the most diverse families of plants on the planet, exceeding 30,000 species across the planet. The roses are not quite that successful. We estimate them at around just under 5,000 species across the planet, which does highlight how successful daisies have been when you compare them to something like the rose family. The second picture there is a good example of another rose, which is not bittersweet, it's meadow sweet. And this is a rose member, except it looks nothing like a rose. So there's all sorts of things that you can find in this family that could surprise you. Taking that into account, what kind of number would you put on the wild roses of Britain? Out of the 4,828 species on the planet, how many do we have in the UK? And that answer is about 60. And I've said 60-ish there. My flower book is nearly a decade old now, so it might well be that it's getting a bit out of date, but I have 59 in there. There could be a couple of others that have become garden escapees as well, but it sits around the 60 bracket. This family includes some fairly familiar flowers and plants and fruits to us, including the plums, the cherries, the peaches, the apricots, and the almonds. They're all sitting within the rose family. So not only is this an important family for the flowers themselves, but the fruits that some of their members produce are crucial to many human communities and people all over the planet for economy. So they're a very important family of flowers. As I say, they have a worldwide range, but they are most diverse in the Northern Hemisphere. This is possibly because they first evolved in the Northern Hemisphere and therefore have been here the longest, and slowly spread to other parts of the planet, either naturally before humanity or with humanity afterwards. There are a couple examples in this presentation, actually, of British flowers, British roses, that have become invasive species in places like Australia in other areas. So we've certainly aided their spread across the planet. The individual species in this family can be found as trees, shrubs, or much smaller herbaceous plants. It isn't anything to say that a rose would be something small in the garden. It could be a very large tree or a very small ground dwelling and ground hugging flower. So size is nothing to go off to tell it that something could be a rose. The herbs are mostly perennial, but some annuals also exist, which basically just means that a lot of the roses across the planet will come back year after year after year. That's perennial. An annual flower is one that grows from the seed and in a single year becomes mature, flowers, makes fruit, and then dies and does not come back. So most roses are perennials that will keep coming back year after year. Now, the two pictures we've got here are one of a classic rose and one of a no classic rose. And tonight, I'm going to focus on flowers that, broadly speaking, are vaguely rose-like. So you've got these big, broad petals, 5 petals surrounding the flower with an explosion of the inside of the flower. And each petal often is notched. If you see that it's kind of a heart shape, isn't it? So that makes up the shape of the petal. The leaves also take note that what you've got to the left of that flower is a collection of leaves that are in an order. So there you've got 5 leaves, haven't you, coming off the same stem. And different species of rose will have a different orientation of leaves. Some will have more than 5, some will have less than 5, but generally that will help you as well. Okay, so to our first wild rose of Britain, the field rose. This is perhaps the one that is most widely found across the UK. I won't say most likely found because it depends on where you live, but certainly if we're talking about, across the UK, this is the first one I would talk about. With a nice, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the last picture is, I don't think it is the same actually. That's not a field rose. The leaves are slightly too shiny if you look at them. These leaves are much more what you'd expect from something that's native to Britain. They're not very tough. They're not very shiny or waxy. They're quite matte looking. And quite often the field rose will have a yellow center, but again, I've used this picture just to show that it doesn't always have that. But normally it's a white flower with the nice notched petals. This shrub can grow between 3 and 4 meters tall. So it's a sizable shrub that can be found out in an open field or in a hedgerow setting, in a woodland. The spines that you can see infrequently in the picture that cover the body or the trunk and the branches really do help it to survive too much destruction from predators, or herbivores I should say, such as deer, sheep, cow, as you would have had before humans with wild cattle and wild horses as well. Then you also have the rose hips as well that grow on the flowers themselves. These are fruits that come later in the year around August and September. And although the flower itself can be used to identify a rose, between the species we have, they can be tricky at the same time. So waiting for the rose hips to appear is another really great way to confirm what you're looking at. The field rose, in terms of its hip, is quite elongated and long and reddish in color all over. And the length of it, almost like a grape, if you will, can help you identify that it is a field rose you are looking at. And it grows mainly in soils that are fairly decent in nutrients, and it can be grown in all sorts of different places. It tends not to like acidic soils. So that's the one thing that it tends not to like, but it's otherwise the general rose of the wild. The next rose to look at is one called the burnet rose, which is probably second most frequently found across the country. Granted that the flower is quite similar in this case, but the leaves are ever so slightly more serrated and they're a little bit tougher. You also get a few more leaves in any augmentation. If you look at the top right of the picture, rather than 5 or 7, you've probably got 9 or so as you go all the way down the stalk of the burnet rose. And again, one of the key ways to tell the difference is actually waiting until August and September for the rose hip, the fruit, to develop afterwards. Because when you compare this to the field rose, you'll see that rather than having a grape shape elongated, the burnet rose is a round shape, and you can still see the remnants of the flower itself quite clearly at the top of the hip. These structures contain an enormous amount of vitamin C. In fact, they're one of the best sources of vitamin C we have growing in the UK, except that we often don't use them enough for this reason. They have amongst the highest concentration of vitamin C found in any fruit or any vegetable. And it's estimated that they contain around 710% of your daily vitamin C requirements. So that just gives you an idea of how good this stuff could be if we utilize it a bit more and it becomes more mainstream. You can turn this into things like marmalades and spreads. And I imagine that at the moment, if you go into a nice garden center, that might be the place you'll find a rose hip spread. I don't think you're going to find it in one of the largest supermarkets. It's more of a specialty thing, but that may change in the future. This is the map of the burnet rose, so you can look at the map and see where you live and see whether you're anywhere near to one of these locations. As you can see, scattered. The northwest where I am is pretty good, and it goes down to Birmingham, still pretty good. Loops around towards Hampshire, still pretty good. Devon, Scotland is not doing bad for it, but it is a little bit of a lottery in terms of whether you'll pick them up in your area, and you might just find an odd one growing in the middle of the field that no one's ever written down before. So it's well worth checking the hips later in the year. Now this one's a really special one, sweet briar, great name. A flower that has rather straight and almost angular petals. You'll see that rather than having petals that overlap each other so you can only see the tips, you can see that they have straight sides up to the crowning top and quite a deep notch in them as well. It's not just a kind of heart shape. The notch really does come in to the middle of the top of the petal. So when you see the flower, this pinkish hue and everything else can help you identify sweetbriar. But actually, if you know where you're walking or where you live or where you are, that can also help you work it out, because this is more of a limestone loving flower. So if you know that you're at a nature reserve that has a limestone base and is quite alkaline, then the rose you find is probably going to be sweetbriar, as opposed to something like a field rose, which could also exist there, but this is the one that copes the best in terms of where it's growing. The hips, again, are something to look at as they grow, for the first time in August and September. Their shape is more conical, so they're wider at their base and narrower at the top. And it has to be said that the older they get, they do bulk out a little bit. But what the other point you can see here is that at the end of the hip, where you would expect to see the ends of the flower, most of that has dropped off, and you don't really see much residue of the flower itself, the petals or the middle parts of the flower, and that can help you. It's found in other countries as well, this flower, and in other places, it gets used for different reasons. As an example, in Tunisia, this flower is made into natural flower water. This is one of the flowers used to create a natural flower water because of the subtle taste in the water, presumably. And this is again another map showing the the areas where you could find them. Similar, very similar to the map we saw earlier, with a similar distribution as well. There are actually, I don't think I've said this yet, in terms of the real roses that look like roses, there are only 5 of them in the UK in the wild. And this is another reason why working out which is which can be fairly fun and quite easy to do. Another really widespread one is the dog rose. Now, rather than having the white petals of a field rose, this often has an off pink color, but the petals are more heart-shaped. They're not straight like sweet briar, you see, these have straight sides, whereas with the dog rose, they're much rounder in a heart shape, and they're not as deeply notched at the top of the heart either on each petal. The name of this plant is one that I have tried to work out where it comes from for a long time, and there are many different stories to explain why it's called a dog rose. It is not the only flower that has dog in its name, because there's dog's mercury, there's dog violet, and therefore the suggestion that I follow the most is that there was some original link to the meaning of the word dog that was given to these flowers. And that could well be that the link was, when you called something dog, it meant false. So this is the false rose. It's not the field rose, it's a different species. It's not the right mercury, it's the poisonous one. It's not the right violet, it's the different one. So that is one option that there could be. I have heard other people say that it could be because the sticks that dog roses produce are quite long and quite straight, and so dogs quite like chasing them. It's a nice story. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's a nice one to suggest at any rate. Yeah, so that's a decent one to find. And again, here you've got another example, just showing you a bit of difference in them. Again, you've got that nice rounded shape of the petals. Even when it's a bit more open, you can still tell it's dog rose from that roundness on the edge of each petal. And the hips are off to the back and the right of this picture, darker in color, not black, but very dark red, almost purple really. And rather than being conical, they're closer to grape shape as well, which we saw in the field rose as well, but they are darker in color. They don't get the same brightness as the fields. And I did include a map of this one as well. As you see, I mean, I say widely found, that's probably my experience of living in the Northwest. As you can see, it's fairly decent in the Northwest. If I lived on the East Coast, however, if I went over to Hull or something like that, I might well struggle to find one of these flowers. And it does depend where you live, both in England, Wales, and Scotland, and Northern Ireland actually as well. So yeah, it depends on where you live. And lastly, out of the 5 proper roses, there is the Japanese, or otherwise called beach rose. And this is a non-native species, making up the 5th in our rose group. And also probably the easiest to tell apart from the others, because the leaves, let's start with the leaves around this flower, they're much shinier, and that's because they're waxier. Their waxy cuticle is thicker, and that helps them to survive in environments where it's sunnier or where it's saltier, and hence the beach rose does quite well down at the beach. And most of our native roses don't have that. They're designed for hedgerow and for shady places, so they don't need a waxy cuticle or a thick waxy cuticle. But obviously with this rose, you do also have bright pink as the color in the flower. However, you can find pure white Japanese roses as well. And again, this is when you look at the leaf. It's thicker, it looks sturdier, and the serrations around the edges are less. It looks more rounded as a whole leaf, so that can help you. Further to that, the rose hips are very obvious because they are squashed pretty much completely flat. And that is one of the ways that you can recognize them. They don't have a conical shape. They don't have anything else that would suggest that they're anything else as well. And in terms of where they're found, quite widespread again, more westernly generally, but Norfolk, Suffolk, not doing too badly, parts of the northeast, Scotland, you know. And so it's funny with roses, you kind of think that they are found everywhere, and most of them are not. Most of them have got very varied distributions indeed. Now, moving on to some roses that you might not consider as roses, includes a lot of our fruits as well, such as the blackberry. The blackberry is actually sitting within the rose family as well. And although its fruit is very different from the rose hips we've been looking at, the flower of blackberry, if you look at it, is actually quite similar to the rose. It's much smaller, but it's still those big 5 petals all the way around the outside. And actually, some of them, you can see a little notch in the top of the petals, in the same way that all those roses have that we were looking at. And it still has this explosion of, you know, in the middle. The name has completely gone out of my head for what those are called. But the reproductive parts of the flower, really large and really obvious. Stamen is one of the names, and that's what I can remember. Within this group of flowers, of course, we have a number, and again, it's number 5 again in this category. The second is the raspberry, which is also a rose. Each raspberry contains 100 tiny fruits called druplets, filled with a single seed. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, these two groups of roses look so different, is that their strategy for spreading their seed is very different. With a rose hip, you've got an outer layer of flesh, a singular hip with lots of, you know, up to 100 seeds in the middle. A raspberry or a blackberry does the same thing, except it gives each seed that little packet of flesh surrounding it individually. And both methods work, and they're just different methods that can coexist side by side as a result. The third in this group is the dewberry, which generally speaking looks like a dusty blackberry for me personally. It normally has this kind of dusty blue color and very large druplets. Normally that means that there are far fewer druplets than on a blackberry, so that can help you identify a dewberry. And they are often found in kind of sandy conditions by the coast, or by the sides of roads where the conditions are similar, or up in the uplands. I found them in the Peak District as well. So it's one to keep an eye out for. Again, heading to a limestone area with sweet briar growing alongside it, you might well find the stone bramble. And the stone bramble is a species that has very few druplets. And that's because in the center of that druplet is one large, very large seed, and that's the stone that gives it its name. So you can eat this one. All of these 5, you can eat them, but this one has a large stone that you'd want to spit out. And lastly, there's the much sought after cloudberry. Even though its orange color makes it very desirable, it's not widely cultivated. And so in Britain, at least, it can be very difficult to find, especially because it's kind of at the southernmost point of its distribution globally. If you really want to go see cloudberry, then head up to Scandinavia, Finland and Norway, that kind of area, and you'll see loads of them. Here in Britain, if you go to parts of the Dark Peaks, you might get lucky and see one of these plants flowering or fruiting even, but because of our conditions and our weather systems, the plant can be growing, but it won't flower every year. And so that can be tricky to find. So we talked about roses, and we've talked about kind of blackberry and that group of roses as well, but there are many others. And here's a good example of a plant that you might not have, if you know it, you might not have thought it was a rose, but once you start looking at it, it becomes clearer. Tormentil is a very common flower in upland areas or cliff tops, or anywhere where the soil conditions are quite acidic. This is an acidic lover. It will live in these places simply because other plants, even other roses, like the field rose, as I mentioned before, doesn't like acid conditions. And therefore, if Tormentor can cope with that, it will do very well because there's less competition. This group of roses, Potentilla, is so named because that scientific name translates as powerful despite the small size. And this was with understanding why they called it this, because there are various stories of its powers. Tormentil is the common name, and that also tells of what people used to believe its power was. It was able to cause torment. Now, how it would do this is that if you had your cattle grazing on a field with Tormentil growing, the farmers and landowners used to notice that their cattle would start developing very brittle bones. And therefore breaks and fractures became commonplace in the herd. And the conclusion was that because they were eating this flower, it was causing their bones to have these problems. But in reality, the fact that Tormentil grows on very nutrient poor soil means that everything the cattle were eating were nutrient poor, they didn't have much nutrients within them. And therefore, it wasn't Tormentil exactly, it was just the general habitat that the cattle lived in that was causing the problems. And therefore, Tormentil as a name doesn't quite ring true, but certainly from their point of view, this was a powerful, powerful plant, despite a fairly small size. Another potentilla is creeping cinquefoil. This is a great picture of one with a little red flower mite on one of the petals as well. Again, you've got this rose shape to the flower, 5 big petals, or just noting that with Tormentil, you're missing a petal. So that can kind of lead you away from thinking rose, but also Tormentil has this overall square shape of the flower. The notches are so broad that it rounds off the petal completely in a straight line, giving it a square appearance. Whereas normally a rose would have these 5 petals. And again, you see that notch in the top of the petal, very distinctive of the rose family. Cinquefoil comes from the leaf. You can see it behind the flower here with 5-leafed, and that's where it gets the name from. Creeping comes from the fact that it is quite literally a plant that creeps along the floors of pathways or rocky outcrops, or often ex-human habitation places. You know, if you've got an old country house that was knocked down 50 years ago, then that has been left, something like creeping cinquefoil can well come in and take advantage. It is a perennial plant, as with many of the roses, and was at one point used to disinfect wounds. This is one of those uses that people had for flowers because they believed, you know, that this is what they were used for until they actually knew. And I think that the use of that has dropped off a little bit. And another really common potentilla to look out for this year that probably is already flowering in places is silverweed. And silverweed is really easy to spot because of the large floppy petals that are bright yellow again, but you're starting to get your eye in now for a rose flower, this big central explosion of a firework, and these large broad petals all the way around gives you a rose. Silverweed is so named though because of the leaves. They are very silvery when they're young, and as they mature and become green on top, if you turn them over, then they've got silver on the underside instead. And this is a really common plant up and down the UK. It will grow by the side of the road, you know. It really is quite easy to spot. But lastly, I'll mention another cinquefoil in a different genus this time, but the marsh cinquefoil is the opposite. It's quite a specific cinquefoil, and possibly a good example of a flower that is a rose, but is almost unrecognizable as a rose when you compare it to the others. Very pointy petals, very triangular. But again, you've got this 5-petaled appearance coming up again and again and again that can help you identify its family. And once you identify a flower's family, you're nearly there to work out what it is, because you can discount all the thousands of other species it could be. You've only got 60 roses in this country, so it's one of them. This flower lives on marshes, bogs, fens, generally in the northwest and east of the UK, and it's a rarity across the country. But as an example of how important rarities can be, on it there is a certain type of, I've kept the marsh cinquefoil there. That's because this beetle doesn't have a common name. This is effectively the marsh cinquefoil weevil. It's a little tiny beetle that only lives on marsh cinquefoil, and therefore its future is solely reliant on that flower. And so when you save one flower and keep it going, you're actually supporting a whole host of other creatures that just boost the amount of life that can live in one area at one time. And that is the distribution of the marsh cinquefoil. Well worth a search. It's a beautiful red flower, red purplish flower. And there's not many in Britain that have that coloration, so it's gorgeous. For conservation then, of the botanical world, you've got Plant Life, which is a great charity that you can go to support, and they support the biodiversity of flowers and the of botany as well. The wildlife trusts also look at all sorts of wildlife, including botanical species and flower species. And I'm mentioning all these maps today, and I've always used these maps. And that is, those maps are from the NBN network, and that is the place to go looking if you want to look at the maps. If you want to see where the golden eagles have ever been recorded, or where the wildcats, the Scottish wildcats, have been. If you search Scottish wildcat and put the letters NBN after it, it'll bring up a map to show you where those records are. And you can actually add to those records at various places, but iRecord is a good place to go first to sign up and put records on there, because those officially go into the NBN network. Not all websites that you can record wildlife on will go into the NBN, because they have to be met by certain criteria. Everyone has to be happy that they're real and it's the real McCoy. So iRecord is a really good place to start looking, because that is one that does get accepted. Thank you very much then for watching. I will stop the video there, and if you've watched on YouTube, thank you very much, and I'll see you again.